Okay, and with that, good evening, hello, everybody, and lovely to see you on this Sunday night. What the hell day is it? The 24th, of course, because I did the same thing last night. It's just, it was also today, 2 in the morning. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, or Maine, as we say on my website, which is MAEN, stands for morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you may be. Where we are is, of course, still in pandemic lockdown, at least here in California, where we sensibly do not want to catch any potentially fatal diseases. Call us crazy. I don't know. That's just how we are. But anyway, so that's what we're doing here. Excuse the tired face, the bags under the eyes. It's always tough after doing one of those 2 o'clock in the morning things because I don't get to sleep until about 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. and then I have to get up to do all the regular things of the day. So forgive me for being slightly fuzzy around the edges. Lovely to see you all. I see many people saying hello online already, and I'm very pleased to hear it. Tonight we are going to be reading the second part of the Elric, Pogo, Jimi Hendrix acid trip story. As those of you who missed last week, don't worry, I'll do a short précis just before I start in a couple of minutes. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to mention or talk about. Nothing really. We're just doing what we do here. We are working. I just finished or sent off the first draft of the short novel, the short Ostenard novel I've been working on, to various readers, like my publishers and my other friends and readers, who will first go through it and let me know how completely wrong or fatuous or anything that I've done is, which is a very helpful thing. And then what else have I been doing? Yeah, just like stuff. You can't tell from here because this shot has been carefully curated. But if I move this computer like an inch or two to either side and tilted it just a little bit, you'd see the mess that still remains in the office that still has to be cleaned. But I have carefully arranged things so you can't see that when I'm reading. Not that it's very interesting, just for my own peace of mind, my own pride. So Deb is upstairs doing things, and she sends her love to everybody as well. And what else is there? You can hear the dogs are being fed. Our son has finally emerged from the cavernous fastness of his lair to feed the dogs, half an hour late. And so you can hear them going upstairs, and cat's sleeping. We're groovy. Everything is happening. So without further ado, because we've still got a long section of book to read, or a long section of story to read, I am going to return to Go Ask Elric. For those of you who were not around last week, or who were around but were fuzzy for whatever reasons, I will remind you very briefly what the story is about, or seems to be about. It is my kind of autobiographical character, whose name is Pogo Cashman. And Pogo has become kind of a stand-in for me. He's a teenager from California in the 70s. He's a little more of a dunderhead than my friends and I, or at least I'd like to think he is. But it's definitely the spirit of the times. And in the story, Pogo, who's sitting in his friend Sammy's room, and they've both taken some acid, and as they're coming on, and Sammy has put "Go Ask Alice" by Jefferson Airplane on the stereo. There's another thing people don't have much anymore. You know, "Go Ask Alice" and "Feed Your Head" and all that kind of, you know, psychedelic, crazy song. And Pogo slipped off into an acid trip, but little does he know what he has arrived at instead of a normal acid trip is he has he has found himself in an Elric of Melniboné story. And Elric is like really honestly the most teenage heavy metal kind of hero, written by Michael Moorcock, of course, and the story was done for an anthology. Elric is, God, what isn't he? Elric is a magician, an albino. He is the last son of the Melnibonéan emperors, the dragon emperors, but he has been displaced from his throne and wanders the world, always miserable. He is very weak and feeble without special drugs, and the use of his sword, Stormbringer, his black rune sword, that helps to keep him alive. But Stormbringer is a sentient object. It is not merely a sword, it is a sort of being, and it feeds on souls. And that gives Elric strength as well. So it is Elric, E-L-R-I-C. Last time while I was reading, I kept saying Eric. And it's not Eric, it's Elric. So that's just fatigue. Anyway, in the story, so Pogo, who's discovered that he can manipulate Dream in this acid trip that he's on, he can make himself big or small, and he has done that a couple of times to help Elric escape from an evil wizard who was holding him. And at the last moment, Elric's patron, sort of god, I guess you'd say, Lord Arioch of Chaos, has showed up also. And to Pogo's eyes, he looks like Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones. And Arioch has essentially told them, you know, the only way you can get back your strength, even though you have your sword, you're still weak. And that's because the sword's energy has been stolen by accident by the magician who was holding him. And the sword's energy, some of it, a big part of it or half of it or whatever, has been dispersed out somewhere, and you have to find it. And also, there is the dire threat of what Lord Arioch, Duke Arioch, calls the chronophage. So Elric has just stuck his hand in a flame to pain himself enough to be able to make the chaos magic work. And the last part, he's just taken his hand out of the flame, Elric has, and he calls Pogo Kashman, because of course, you know, the kind of traditional two names thing he doesn't know about. So he has just told Pogo to take his hand, and then they have fallen down into an endless or seemingly endless darkness. And that's where we left the story. So that's basically it. Pogo, Elric, acid, the chronophage, and Stormbringer, the rune sword. And there we are. And Pogo is a 15-year-old guy in desert boots and a Lou Reed t-shirt from Reseda, California. Okay, so here we go with what I assume tonight we will finish the whole rest of, which is Go Ask Elric. Curiouser and curiouser, my ass, this is just plain weird. Pogo had grabbed Elric's white hand, not without some trepidation. The gayness of the whole thing aside, he had also worried the albino might jam his fingers into the torch as well. An instant later, they were off to Wonderland. Or something. Actually, what made it frightening is that it wasn't really anything. The closest comparison Pogo could make was the light show ride down to Jupiter in 2001: A Space Odyssey. But that had been a day at the beach compared to this. Bodiless, yet achingly cold, he was tumbling like a meteor through shouting darkness. Streamers of thinly colored something or other flared past him, but although they looked like ragged clouds, he could sense that they were somehow alive, that it was their voices which raged and bellowed in his ears, enraged by his relative warmth and mobility. He could also sense that if they caught him, they would do things to him he wouldn't like at all. Pogo closed his eyes, but it made no difference. Either he really didn't have a body, he couldn't see his hands, his legs, or even his faintly embarrassing suede desert boots, and thus had no eyes, or the place he was, the things that shouted at him, were all behind his eyelids, in his brain. But if the bits with Elric and the dungeon and that Rolling Stones guy, if they had all been a hallucination too, how come they felt real? And this part felt crazy. Pogo had just decided that it was time to seriously contemplate coming down from this whole trip and wondering how to do it when he popped through a hole in a much more normal-looking sky and tumbled to a halt on an endless, grassy plain. A single hill loomed in the distance. Otherwise, the place was incredibly boring, like the kind of state park even his parents would drive through without stopping. Elric rose to his knees beside him, clutching Stormbringer in his blistered right hand. The albino looked very real and quite weary. "We are here, Pogo Cashman, wherever here may be." "You mean you don't know?" "No more than you do. Stormbringer, not I, has led us to this place." Considering all that had gone before, this new wrinkle worried Pogo rather more than it should have. He found himself longing for the shadowy dungeon, which had begun to feel quite familiar, almost homey. Could you get lost in an acid hallucination? Somehow get off the proper track and go permanently astray? He dimly remembered his Cub Scout den master saying that when you were lost in the woods, you were supposed to stay in one place until people found you. But somehow I don't think Mr. McNulty was going to show up with a compass and a canteen and take me home, whether I stayed in that dungeon or not. "Bummer," he said aloud with considerable feeling. "So what do we do now?" Before Elric could answer, a booming crash knocked them both to the ground, which itself trembled as if in sympathy. A vast globe of light bloomed on the distant hilltop, spreading and reddening. "Whoa! Nukes?" Pogo asked, but he didn't really want to know. A moment later, something rustled in the grass. Pogo looked down, then leaped to his feet with a shout of alarm. The plain was alive with serpents and rodents, hundreds, no, thousands of them, all moving in a single direction with the speed of complete terror. "They're running from that bomb on the hill," Pogo shouted, searching his memory for nuclear attack information. "Duck and cover!" Elric II was on his feet, shaking loose a cluster of panicked ground squirrels from his boot. "I do not know what should frighten these creatures so," he called above the whipsaw hissing of the grass, "and do not recognize the word you use, but they are running toward the hill." Pogo turned. The albino was right. The rush of small creatures bent the grass like a heavy wind. There were insects, too, flashing like dull jewels as they flew and hopped, all speeding toward the hill, where the globe of red light still hung, although it seemed to be fading. "Look, Pogo Cashman!" Elric now pointed in the opposite direction. Pogo turned again, frowning. His neck was beginning to hurt. A dark line had appeared on the far horizon, a moving band of shadow, and it was from this that the local fauna were beating such a hasty retreat. As he and Elric stared, the line moved closer. It was hard to see clearly at such a distance, harder still because of the clouds of dust and chaff thrown up by the fleeing animals. Pogo squinted and was glad for the concealing dust. What he could see was quite unpleasant. "It's weird-looking guys in armor, and Jesus, there's a whole shitload of them. Thousands." "If they are not a chaos horde, they are a marvelous imitation," Elric said grimly. "See, they are twisted and malformed. Yeah, ugly too." Elric pushed Stormbringer into his belt and clutched Pogo's shoulder. "They are too many to fight, especially with my rune blade in its diminished state. In any case, we are too exposed here, and we know nothing of this world. What you're saying is, let's run away, right? Good idea." Elric seemed about to try to explain something, but instead turned and began loping toward the hill. Pogo hurried to catch up. "Oh, this is just like gym class," he thought, feeling a stitch already beginning to develop in his side. "But at least in gym you get to wear sneakers. What kind of stupid acid trip is this, anyway?" It was difficult to run through the living sea of animals, but Pogo had already accustomed himself in the dungeon to stepping on furry things. Besides, one look back convinced him that the pursuing horde of beastmen would happily do the same to him. Gasping for breath, pumping his elbows with a determination that would have made his PE teacher, Mr. Takagawa, stare in disbelief, he sprinted toward the solitary hill. Elric faltered, and Pogo suddenly realized how difficult this must be for a man who until minutes ago had been hanging in chains. He grabbed the albino's elbow. It was astonishing how thin he was beneath his tattered shirt, and half tugged him along, which made their progress even more agonizingly slow. Pogo was now feeling so frightened that a part of him considered just letting the pale man fall so he could run at full speed. Once, back in junior high school, he had left Sammy lying with a twisted ankle after they had rung old Jacobson's doorbell and ran. Sammy had gotten caught and had to go to the emergency room too. Pogo had never felt good about that. "Come on, dude, we're almost there," he panted. The albino struggled on. Something was echoing in Pogo's ears as they reached the skirts of the hill, a mysterious, almost pleasant buzzing too low and soft to identify. There was something in the way it vibrated in the bones of his skull that he knew he should recognize, but he was too busy dragging Elric and dodging high-speed rodentia to give it proper consideration. They began to clamber up the slope. The greatest number of fleeing animals parted and passed around the hill like a wave around a jetty, but enough accompanied Pogo and Elric to continue to make their progress difficult. One large, white, long-eared creature ran right between Pogo's legs and bounded up the slope ahead of him. He was almost certain it had been carrying a pocket watch. "Never had acid like this." Even his thoughts were short of breath. The red glow hovering over the hilltop had almost disappeared now. Pogo was trying both to dodge around the few bedraggled trees dotting the slope and observed the peak when something suddenly hit him hard in the back and toppled him forward. Before he could do more than register the pain in his skinned palms and note that Elric II was lying on the ground beside him, something very sharp poked the back of his neck. "The first of the hell troop," a voice said, "and not the foulest of the lot, I'll be bound, although these two still have little to brag about. Do you think the prince will want to see them?" "No, he is deep in his spells. I say we skewer them here and then finish the barricade." A certain breathlessness lay beneath the hard words. Despite his own fast-beating heart, Pogo recognized that these men were frightened. "Well, if they're waiting here to fight the Monsters fan club, that's not much of a surprise," he thought. "We are not enemies," Elric said hoarsely. "We are not part of the Chaos Horde. They are fleeing it." "They speak." "Yeah," Pogo offered, "but we'd probably do it better if we weren't eating turf, man." The pointy thing was withdrawn from his nape. As Pogo clambered slowly to his feet, he identified it as the business end of a very long spear. The man holding it and his companion looked much like the guards Pogo had met at the Chan's palace, except not so stylishly dressed. They wore ragged chainmail, dented helmets, and expressions of worried fatigue. "You are not mortal men," said one of their captors suspiciously. "We are, whatever you may think of our appearance," Elric assured him. "Now, if you are part of the force that opposes that oncoming horde, and if, as it appears, there is no bargaining with them, we will fight at your side." "We will?" Pogo thought the runaway idea had been much superior. Elric turned to him. The prospect of a fight appeared to have revived the albino somewhat, although he still seemed dreadfully weak. "We cannot outpace them forever. If we must make a stand, it should be here, with other brave souls." "Whatever, man." Pogo was again giving serious thought to coming down. The problem was, he couldn't figure out how to do it. Everything seemed rather dreadfully and inescapably real. When he closed his eyes, he could still hear Elric and the soldiers talking. "If you are truly allies, you are strange-looking ones. We should take you to our lord." "And who is he?" "Why, Sheme Uendridge, the gypsy prince himself." The man seemed to expect a gasp of startlement from Elric. When he spoke again, he sounded disappointed. You have not heard of him? I am certain he is a man of great bravery to command such loyalty, Elric said. Take us to him, please. Pogo opened his eyes. It was useless. Same stupid place, same stupid trip, same ravening army of beast men moving rapidly across the plain toward them. The soldiers led them up the hill at a jog. The cries of the oncoming horde echoed louder and louder, and so did the strange, vibratory, almost sounds that Pogo had noticed earlier. The horde was baying for blood, voices as discordant as a group of frat boys opening the dozenth keg on a Friday night. Pogo stumbled ahead, growing less and less enchanted with the products of his own imagination every moment. More soldiers, sullen and fearful, turned to watch them. At last they reached the top of the hill, bare but for a copse of trees and a small group of armored men. At the center, holding in his hand a blade that looked as though it had been carved from a single piece of ivory, stood the gypsy prince. Pogo teetered to a stop, goggle-eyed. Next section. Elric strode forward, lifting his hands in a gesture of peace as he approached the gypsy prince. There was little time to be wasted on mistrust. We come as allies, sir. I am Elric of Melnibone, and this is Pogo Kashman of... He waited for his companion to add the proper details, then noticed that Pogo was no longer within his peripheral vision. He looked down. The young man had fallen to his knees, his arms extended before him in an attitude of worship. For one so casual in other ways, he seemed quite formal about meeting royalty. Elric felt a moment's ill humor that he, who had once sat the dragon throne itself, had received no such obeisance. Still, hanging in chains was undoubtedly a curb to good first impressions. Jimmy! Shrieked Pogo Kashman and banged his forehead against the ground. Oh my God, Jimmy, it's you! I knew it, man, I knew it! Sammy will be so bummed he missed this! Startled, Elric took a step away, then turned to survey the gypsy prince, who seemed just as disconcerted as the albino. Sheme Uendridge was a handsome, dark-skinned man no older than Elric. His wild, curly black hair was restrained by a scarf tied about his forehead, and he was clad in bright but mismatched finery that made him look something like a corsair of the Vilmir Straits. In fact, he dressed much as Elric did. Stranger still, as the dark gypsy prince was in some ways a reverse image of the albino, so was his bone-white sword a distorted mirror version of Stormbringer. Was that why the rune sword had drawn them here? Your friend seems to know me. Uendridge's voice was soft and lazy, but with hidden strength. Given speech, thought Elric, so might a leopard speak. But I confess I do not know him. Rise, man, he called to Pogo Kashman. If I have forgotten you, that is my shame, but there is much to occupy my thoughts today. He turned to Elric, and as his gaze slid down to Stormbringer, his eyes widened a trifle, but in speculation rather than worry. If you are allies, you are welcome, but I fear you have joined what will surely be the losing side. He smiled despite his gloomy words. Elric could not help liking him. We will be proud to fight alongside you, whatever the case. Elric glanced at Pogo Kashman, who still looked like someone in a narcotic dream. I have fought against such chaos troops before. They are not unbeatable. The gypsy prince raised an eyebrow. Ah, but they are merely the outrunners. The chronophage is our true and direst enemy. Startled, Elric opened his mouth, eager to question Uendridge, but before he could utter a word, a ragged shout came rolling up the hillside from below. They come! They come! The gypsy prince turned to Elric. His mustachioed upper lip twitched in another smile. I sense we might have much to talk about, you and I, but I fear we are about to be interrupted. He lifted his sword. Ah, Cloud Hurler, again we stand in a strange place as death rushes upon us. I should never allowed my destiny to become entangled with yours. A strange low humming came from the white blade, a kind of vibratory music unlike anything Elric had ever heard, although with some inexplicable similarities to Stormbringer's own battle song. Pogo Kashman lifted his head and shook it dreamily, as though the sword spoke to him in some deep manner. The baying of the horde was growing louder. The dark tide of their armored forms swirled around the base of the hill. "But who or what is this chronophage?" Elric shouted. "Is it the master of these creatures?" "No." Uendridge beckoned for his soldiers to gather around. It is a force, a blasphemy, a thing that should not be. It devours all in its path. These mad chaos things only run ahead of it, seizing a last opportunity to smash and rend and murder before the greater destroyer comes." A small troop of attackers had burst through the barricade at the bottom of the hill and were rushing up the slope. Their leader, whose sagging skin seemed to have melted and run like candle wax, swung a long iron bar studded with rusting spikes. His cohorts, their faces and limbs also distorted, hopped and limped after him, barking like maddened dogs. Elric lifted Stormbringer as the beast men approached. His weakness made it feel very heavy. He was barely able to deflect the melted man's flailing bar. Neither did he feel the runeblade's usual sentience, its familiar battle lust. As the bar whistled toward him again, Elric ducked under it and jabbed up into his foe's throat. It seemed an effort even to pierce the runneled flesh, but at last the rune sword sank in and a shower of watery blood spattered the albino's face. But Stormbringer did not drink the creature's soul. It remained as lifeless as any old iron blade. Two of the melted man's companions came shambling forward as Elric struggled to free his blade. A flick of white sheen from one side, and the nearer limped on a few steps without a head before crumbling to the ground. Elric darted a quick look, but Uendridge had already moved away again, carrying his ivory sword to the support of some of his hard-pressed soldiers. The second beast man moved in more slowly, hefting a huge, crude axe. His mouth seemed to have slipped down to his neck, where it gaped wetly. The axe rose and began to fall, even as Elric at last yanked Stormbringer free. He whirled, knowing he could not bring it up in time to prevent the blow. The beast man's teeth were bared in a grin of triumph, gleaming from the hole in his throat. A moment later, he shot into the air and vanished. His axe thumped onto the ground. A giant Pogo Kashman, nearly 10 times Elric's height, stood where the bar wielder had been, his vast hand shielding his eyes against the sun's glare. "Cool," said the giant. "He's really flying." He winced. "Whoa, Splat City." As the albino stared upward in shock, he was nearly beheaded by another member of the horde who ran forward, whirling a long, weighted chain. As Elric began to duck, the creature abruptly disappeared beneath the odd, rubbery sole of the giant's boot. "Pogo Kashman? It is really you?" "Yeah," the giant boomed. "Sorry, Rick, dude. I got kind of startled at first and got small. You almost stepped on me." He examined the underside of his boot. "Ick, I would have looked like that." Elric smiled wearily. "I am too weak to be much amazed, but you are amazing nevertheless. I begin to get some idea of how you defeated the Chan's guardsmen." "Yeah, hang on for a minute, okay?" As the Melnibonean watched, Pogo Kashman squinted as if in deep concentration, then grew even larger. Stepping carefully over Uendridge's soldiers, he crossed to the copse of trees, unrooted one of the largest and oldest, then returned to the battle, holding the tree by the roots. Using it as something between a war club and a broom, within moments he had scraped, slammed, and swept most of the beastmen from the hilltop, tumbling them, broken and shrieking, back down onto the plain, where the rest of the horde cowered in open astonishment. When Uendridge and his men had dispatched the few remaining enemies, a relative calm fell over the hill. The horde of beastmen below seemed in no hurry to resume their assault. I think I should shrink back down again," Pogo Kashman said, setting down his tree. A few squirrels crept out of its upper branches and wobbled away in search of a quieter home. "I'm getting kind of dizzy." The gypsy prince turned from posting a fresh set of sentries. I do not know what the source of your magic is, brave youth, but I think as long as you retain that size, the enemy will hesitate before attacking again. I'll try. Maybe if I sit down. Pogo Kashman sank to the ground. Even with his chin resting on his fists, he was still as large as a moderately tall building. I have never seen the like. The prince shook his head in admiration. We must talk while we have the opportunity, Shemi Uendrich, said Elric. There are mysteries to be unraveled on both sides, but you know more of this situation than we do. What is the chronophage? Rest yourself, friend Elric, for you look ill and tired. I will tell you. Uendrich looked down at the sea of deformed creatures surrounding their tiny island. I will make my tale brief. The chronophage, he explained hurriedly, was not a living thing, but a force of nature, or rather a force of unnature, as his own magicians had told him when it was first manifested. It was brought about by some unprecedented slippage or sparking of the multiverse. We know not what caused it, but only that it threatens all life, all thought, everything. It is a mindless hunger that eats time itself. Where it has passed, nothing remains but swirling, unfathomable emptiness. Even the lords of law are helpless against it. As must be the lords of chaos as well, Elric said thoughtfully. In his backhanded manner, my patron, Arioch, has manipulated me into fighting a battle which he himself cannot fight. You are a servant of chaos? Uendrich seemed a little startled. But I have been taught that its underlings are as soulless as the deformed beasts we fight. I am often an unwilling servant, Elric. Elric explained his family's age-old pact with Arioch and his kin. And both chaos and law manifest themselves differently in different spheres. I myself am not always happy in my service to law, admitted Uendrich. I fear the stultifying world my masters would make should they ever triumph. But they are weak in my world, and to maintain a balance under which mortals can live, their cause must be supported. He continued, explaining that his people had first heard rumors of the chronophage from the fleeting survivors of worlds where it had already struck, and how at last he, the prince, had been forced to the Temple of Law to beg for supernatural aid. There, Donblas herself, the living goddess of serene peace, had told him that the chronophage threatened not just humankind, but the continued existence of the entire multiverse. So I retrieved Cloud Hurler, my singing sword, from the place where it hung. I had sworn an oath that I would not draw it again, since it had served me treacherously during my pacification of the Merrimen, the undersea people, leading me to inadvertent murder. But human oaths mean little set against the safety of time itself. As he spoke, he looked at gleaming Cloud Hurler with an expression that Elric knew only too well. I chose this deserted site, a world my magicians discovered as the place to make a stand against the chronophage. We are few, as you have seen. The rest of my armies are helping my people to flee to another world through portals the wizards have made. Numbers will not avail me here, but I fear that neither will flight save my people if I fail. And your sword? Elric leaned closer. I was brought here by my own blade in quest for its lost essence. Like yours, Stormbringer is more than a mere weapon. Could there be some reason having to do with your sword that we were drawn here? The prince frowned. It is possible. My chief mage, Jaz Jandlar, assisted me in a spell designed to use Cloud Hurler to summon supernatural allies. It has served me that way before, though never reliably. But no allies answered my summoning. Elric sat up, pondering. So you used your blade to call for help. I used my own summoning to call my patron, Duke Arioch of Chaos, to help me regain my lost sword, Stormbringer. But at the very moment I did so, my enemy's chief magicians were tampering with the substance of my rune blade. And now we are both here in this empty place. That makes for too many coincidences. I think I see the manipulation of the lords of the higher planes at work here. He looked up at Pogo Kashman, He was trying to scrape something off the sole of his yards-long shoe. I received an ally, that strange youth. Could it be that you received something of the essence of Stormbringer? The gypsy prince stared at him for a moment, then drew his white blade, which was discolored with various shades of beast-man ichor. I have noticed a certain restlessness in it, but the singing sword has ever been an unpredictable companion. I thought perhaps it responded to the presence of the chronophage. Something had been stirring in the depths of Stormbringer for several moments, as faint but arresting as a distant cry of pain. Elric lifted his rune blade and gently laid it against Cloud Hurler's white length. Suddenly, the sensation of sentience flared. At the same moment, Uendridge reeled back as if he had been struck. By the root, the Black Cat and Demojo Feltar, breathed the prince. Something is indeed alive in that sword of yours. I felt it as though it clawed at my soul. The albino did not speak, but gritted his teeth, suppressing a scream. Stormbringer's lost power was flooding back into the blade and into him as well, boiling through his veins like a river of molten metal. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his muscles trembled convulsively. Uendridge lifted a brown, long-fingered hand as though to aid him, but hesitated, not sure what was happening. As Stormbringer's stolen essence flowed out of the white sword and through his own black blade, Elric felt something of Cloud Hurler, and of its master as well. When at last the inrush stopped, his body throbbed with new strength. He boomed out a laugh, startling Uendridge again. "Oh, gypsy prince! I sense that we have far more in common than just the possession of such weapons. You have been the victim of many of the same cosmic jests that have made my life a misery." Before Uendridge could reply, the moon-wide face of Pogo Kashman suddenly tilted down toward them. "Hey, those weirdos are coming at us again," the giant boomed. "Think you better get ready, man." Elric sprang to his feet. Now that his strength had returned, the prospect of combat almost delighted him. He reminded himself that some of the anticipation was Stormbringer's own inhuman battle glee. It would not do to become careless. "Come, Uendridge, my more-than-brother, we have work to do." The gypsy prince unfolded himself more slowly, but with considerable grace. "I am glad to see you looking healthier, friend Elric." "Here they come!" called Pogo Kashman, rising to his full towering height. "God damn, they're ugly!" Next section. Having at last worked up the courage to face the giant, the beastmen came on without stopping, a seemingly unending tide of brutal, unthinking bloodlust. Despite their bravery and steadfastness, Uendridge's soldiery were dragged down one by one. Some of those overcome did not die for hours, and their screams seemed to darken the air like shadows. Before the long afternoon had waned, only Elric, the gypsy prince, and the giant youth still stood against the horde. As the sun fell into the west behind the ceaseless tide of attackers, the albino and the gypsy prince fought on side by side. Elric shouted and roared, siphoning strength from his defeated enemies. Uendridge chanted, plying his ivory sword with the fierce calm of a warrior monk. The swords gave voice too, all through the long afternoon. Stormbringer's exultant howl was capped and counterpointed by Cloud Hurler's complex, cascading song, as though the two weapons performed some arch-exotic concert piece. For hour upon hour, the blades sang, and their duochrome flicker scythed the awkward beastmen like a field of flowers. But these flowers had fierce thorns. Both Elric and Sheme Uendridge sustained many small wounds. Pogo Kashman retained his giant's form, although in the few brief glimpses he had, Elric could see that his companion's strength was flagging. The youth stationed himself just far enough away to avoid treading on his allies by accident, but close enough that he could protect them when they were too hard-pressed. Despite great weariness, he flailed about him with splintering tree trunks, shouting, "Is it deep to center field? It could be. "Yes, it's a bye-bye baby!" and other incomprehensible battle cries, and causing vast carnage among the Chaos Army. But still, the horde came on. Their numbers seemed truly endless. Elric stooped to pick up his ivory sword, which had slipped from his blood-slicked hands. Elric stood over him, keeping a small knot of attackers at bay. Stormbringer had quaffed deep of the half-souls of beastmen, but it still thirsted. Elric was almost drunk on stolen vitality. If he was to die, it would be laughing, bathed in the gore of his enemies. "I think you enjoy this," Elric shouted above the din as he straightened up. "I wish I could say the same, but it is only horrible, wearisome slaughter." Elric brought Stormbringer down in an almost invisibly swift arc, crushing the gray, jackal-eared head of one of their attackers. "War is only life spreading at a faster pace, O Prince. Only life speeding at a faster pace, O Prince," he cried, although he did not know exactly what he meant. Before he could say more, Pogo Kashman's rumbling voice filled the air. "The sun! Whoa, man, check it out!" Elric looked up to the far horizon. The sun hung there, a flat red disk, but something huge and dark had moved across its face. This was no mere eclipse, unless an eclipse had arms. "The chronophage!" screamed Elric, and drove into the beastmen before him, clearing an opening. "Lift us up, Pogo Kashman!" Elric shouted to his companion. The giant youth squelched through the intervening foes and lifted his two allies in a palm the size of a barge. The many-armed shape on the far horizon was an empty, lightless black that burned at the edges, as though an octopus-shaped hole had been scorched through the substance of reality. As they watched, the tentacles lashed across the sky. Where they passed, nothing remained but sucking blackness. Lightning began to flicker all through the firmament. The beastmen shrieked, a terrible howling that forced Elric to cover his ears. Then the whole horde turned and fled down the far side of the hill, swarming and hobbling like scorched ants. They no longer seemed to care whether they destroyed Elric and his allies or not, but were only intent on staying ahead of the all-devouring chronophage. Within moments, the hill was empty, but for the giant and the two men in his hand. The Chaos Horde had become a fast diminishing cloud of dust, moving toward the eastern horizon. "The greater enemy is here," said Elric. "True doom is at hand." Next section. As he gasped, struggling to regain his breath, Pogo decided that Jimmy's remark was rather unnecessary. The giant flaming squid thing was pretty hard to miss. But this wasn't Jimmy, though. Not exactly. It was hard to keep that straight when it looked like you were holding Mr. Electric Ladyland himself in your sweaty palm, but this guy was some other Hendrix, a reincarnation or something. Still, it had been very satisfying to discover that he had been right after all. The man had been calling him. Those eyes, that sly smile, however snooty he sounded, he was still Jimmy. "So what do we do now?" Pogo asked. He hurt all over, and his arm was so tired it trembled. He reflected briefly on how embarrassing it would be to drop the multiverse's greatest guitar player on his head. "There isn't any such thing as 911 in this world, is there? I mean, a SWAT unit would be kind of comforting right now." Elric and Jimmy winced. Pogo felt bad. He'd have to remember how loud his voice was in this giant size. Not that he'd be able to stay this way much longer. His muscles were throbbing like the first day of gym class, and he already had the granddaddy of all hangovers. "We go forward, probably to die," said Hendrix. It was weird hearing the same educational TV-type speech that Elric used coming out of Jimmy's mouth, but Pogo had finally gotten used to it. "We have stood together," said Elric. "We will fall together, too." Pogo made a face. Elric, with his strength back, was a pretty bitchin' act. More than a little scary, too. But you couldn't carry this King Arthur stuff too far. "How about we win and we don't die?" he said. I like that idea better. Elric's blood-flecked smile was painful to see. It has been a rare pleasure knowing you, Pogo Kashman, but what the lords of the higher planes themselves cannot defeat. But I was listening. You said those high plains dudes brought you guys together on purpose or something like that. Why would they do that if you couldn't win? Seems like there must be easier ways to get you two rubbed out if that's all they wanted. Hendrix and Elric exchanged glances. Perhaps there is something in what he says, Jimmy said slowly. Perhaps. I mean, look at you two. You're like mirror images, kinda. I mean, maybe you're supposed to, I don't know, form a supergroup, like Blind Faith. He darted a look at the western horizon. The chronophage was spreading. Bits of the land itself had begun to disappear as if they had been gnawed by rats the size of continents. Elric stared hard at Pogo, then turned to Jimmy. Raise your blade again, you Endridge. Jimmy hesitated, then lifted the white sword. Elric pushed Stormbringer forward until the tips touched. I have long since given up any kind of faith, blind or otherwise, the albino said. But perhaps. The place where the swords met began to glow with a deep blue light. As Pogo watched, hypnotized, the blue spread and enveloped both men. Pogo could feel a tingling in his palm where they stood. There was a sudden azure flash, bright as a gas flame turned up to infinity. When Pogo could see again, only one figure remained in his hand. It wasn't Elric. It wasn't Jimmy either. She was tall and slender and absolutely naked. Her skin a beautiful coffee and cream color. Her hair streaked both black and white. Beneath her long lashes were eyes like golden coins. In her hand she held a slim gray sword. It is not a moment too soon, she said, in a voice as naturally melodious as birdsong. Pogo stared, slack-jawed and dry-lipped. He felt big, dumb, and sweaty, and 70 feet tall made for a lot of all three. He had never developed a swifter crush, not even the one on Miss Brinkman, his fifth-grade teacher who had worn tartan miniskirts. Who are you? I am the place where law and chaos come together, Pogo Cashman, she said, summoned by the joining of two sundered souls. I am that place, that moment, where seeming opposites are reconciled. Wrong needs right to exist. Night must have its sibling day. The Red Queen and the White are in truth inseparable. She raised her arms and held the sword over her head. It was oddly unreflective. You might call me harmony, or memory, or even history. I am that which holds the fabric of time together, its guardian. Kind of like Glinda from The Wizard of Oz. You have played your part. Now I am free to play mine. And as she spoke, she rose from his hand like a wind-tossed dandelion seed and hovered. He wanted to look at her body. She was exquisite. But it seemed wrong, like wanting to touch up the Virgin Mary or something. She smiled as if she sensed his thought. Just the sight made his heart skip 2 beats. Your time here is almost done, she sang, but the multiverse holds many adventures for you, if you only look for them. Abruptly, she turned and was gone, flying just like a comic book heroine toward the hideous smear on the horizon, the gray sword lifted before her. Pogo thought she was unutterably, heartbreakingly beautiful. At the same time, she sort of reminded him of the hood ornament on a Rolls Royce. He quickly lost sight of her against the pulsating black of the chronophage, although he felt as though a part of him had gone with her. Deciding there was nothing more he could do, Pogo sat down on the ground, then allowed himself to shrink back to his normal size. He sighed with pleasure as his natural stature returned. It was like taking off the world's tightest pair of shoes. Something flickered on the horizon. As Pogo stared, still dizzy from changing sizes, the chronophage writhed, then a searing streak of light moved across one of the tentacles. A soundless howl tremoloed through Pogo, a noiseless vibration that shook his very bones. The great black arm withered and vanished. Where it had been, the sun seemed to be growing back. More streaks of light, like the contrails of science fiction spaceships, ripped across the chronophage. Pogo found himself back on his feet again and cheering. One by one, the other arms shriveled and disappeared, and the blighted sky and earth at last began to return. When the arms had all gone, there came a moment when the rest of the chronophage's black body began to swell, growing larger and larger against the sky until the sun was once more obscured. Pogo's heart pounded. Then a star, a sparkling point of white light, bloomed in the midst of the darkness. An even deeper shuddering ran through Pogo as the chronophage erupted in great shades of tearing black. He was shaken so hard that for a moment everything swam away from him, and as he tumbled into oblivion, he wondered if in fact the battle had been lost after all. Next section. When Pogo opened his eyes again, Elric and Jimmy were lying on the ground beside him. The sky contained nothing more sinister than a few clouds and the setting sun. The albino struggled to sit up. Beside him, Jimmy was slower to rise. Despite their weariness, a single look at the horizon showed both men that they had triumphed. Elric embraced the Dark Prince, then turned to Pogo full of questions, but as the albino reached out a thin white hand to him, Pogo realized he could see the grass through it. Elric saw, too. "I am being drawn back to my world," the albino cried. "I sense that you and I are not to remain too long together in the same place, Shemi Uendridge." He looked at something Pogo could not see and grinned wolfishly. "Ah, it seems that at least I will be granted my revenge against Badishar Chan. Ha ha, that is something." He raised a nearly transparent Stormbringer in salute. "Farewell, Pogo Kashman. You have performed a great service, and for more than just me. If we do not meet again, remember you have Elric of Melniboné's undying gratitude." "Same to you. Take it easy, dude." Pogo was genuinely sorry to see the very white man go. He stood watching, his eyes suspiciously itchy, as Elric began to fade. "Oh, wait a sec," he said suddenly. "Hey, Rick, how do I get back?" "Farewell." The albino's voice still echoed, but he was gone. Pogo slumped to the ground, stunned. He was marooned, like Alice, but down the rabbit hole forever with no way out, and no ruby slippers. No, wait, that was Oz again. Anyway, he was stuck. A hand touched his shoulder. "I am sorry you have lost your companion, Pogo Kashman," said Jimmy, "but I would be honored if you would return with me to my world. You will be acclaimed as a hero. There is much that is beautiful there." Yeah? This was better than nothing, that was for sure. Still, though the necessities of the moment had distracted him, he had not realized until just now how much he had been longing for his true home. "Suppose so. Is there stuff to do?" "To do?" Jimmy laughed. "Aye, much and much. There are places to see. The febrile and primitive swamps of Bayeux, the glittering buildings and fragrant alleys of Narjarlines and Jigago. There is music to be heard. I am myself known as something of a harpist when I am allowed some peace from battle. And women, beautiful women." "Women? I did think this whole trip was kind of short on chicks." Pogo remembered the creature called Harmony and felt a moment of sweetly painful mourning. And would you teach me how to play?" "Certainly," Uendridge said, smiling. "Come, take my hand. You shall be my companion then, Pogo Kashman. The whole multiverse shall know your name." But as Pogo's hand closed around his, Jimmy too became foggy and hard to grasp. The plane on which they stood was also quickly getting dim. For a moment, Pogo suspected that he and Jimmy were merely undergoing more magical travel, but his last diminishing sight showed him that the gypsy prince still gripped the hand of another Pogo, who was disappearing along with him as the world fell away. Last section. Man, that was some intense acid, huh? Sammy was bouncing around the room like a hamster whose wheel was out for repairs. You wouldn't believe what happened to me while you were lying there all out of it. I looked out the window and the mailman looked like some kind of monster. Unbelievable. And the street was like bubbling. Pogo leaned back at his beanbag chair, nursing a joint. Sammy's nonstop monologue was as reassuring as the sound of night traffic to a city dweller. Sounds good, man, he drawled and stared up from the spots of blood on the soles of his desert boots to the poster of Jimi Hendrix on the wall. Was it really true then? That somewhere in the multiverse, an albino guy with a magic sword was remembering his time with Pogo? And, even weirder and cooler, that somewhere else in the multiverse, Jimmy, the very man himself, and his new buddy Pogo Cashman were having adventures together? Sammy put Surrealistic Pillow on the stereo, skipping as always to his favorite song. One pill makes you larger, he tunelessly crooned, anticipating the actual beginning of the vocals by several seconds, something that usually drove Pogo crazy. Sounds good, man, Pogo said, smiling. Sammy wandered over to take the joint from him and stood contemplating the poster of Jimmy with his white Fender guitar. I wonder what Stratocaster means anyway, Sammy said hoarsely, his lungs full of smoke. Cloud hurler. Cloud hurler? Sammy stared at him, then belched out a smoky laugh. Man, you're too high. Nah, it must have something to do with, like, broadcasting. You know, radio or something. Suppose so, said Pogo. Throw me those potato chips, will you? Here. Sammy dropped the bag into his lap. Feed your head. He chuckled. White Rabbit was beginning to pound toward its chugging climax. Feed your head. Got it? Yeah, said Pogo. I got it. And that's the end. Whew, we did that rather neatly, time-wise. So, you've now seen the first adventures of Pogo Cashman. I have another Pogo story around somewhere. I'll have to find it. It's in an anthology, but I don't think I have a copy of the anthology around the house. I wrote it for a Poul Anderson anthology. But I always do enjoy going back to visit Pogo because I enjoy remembering those times, those idiot times of youth. And especially my personal idiot times of youth, because everybody enjoys remembering that, when the music was cooler and we were cooler and everything we did was like totally awesome, and like everything people do these days is completely, utterly lame, which of course it's not. But we all feel that way, and that's why we are the way we are. We are animals, we are organisms that are constrained to spending a good 70 years of our life thinking that everything that happened to us between the ages of 10 and 15 is much better than anything that's ever happened to anyone else. So, just again, want to thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. I am going to go and probably eat something now because we are just about coming up to 8 o'clock at night. But I will be reading same time next week, both the late night, early morning read for the folks outside my time zone or on the opposite of my time zone somehow, and the 7 o'clock reading. I will stay receptive to anybody who wants to make suggestions about how to read or what kinds of things to read. And I see a lot of comments about whistling. Did I sit on something that made a whistling noise? Anyway, I have no idea. Technology, I actually used to work for Apple, but technology still, it hates me, and I have a very troubled relationship with it. So if I made weird whistling noises by accidentally leaning my arm on something, I'll let you know. I should probably get like a book thing that'll be like one of those harmonica holders that Neil Young and Bob Dylan used to wear around their necks, you know, so I could just read with no hands, because this is killing my wrists. And apparently I'm also leaning on the keyboard occasionally. So anyway, I'm waving my hands now. Okay, just so in case any of you were unclear if you thought I was being attacked by alien starfish or something. No, that's just me waving my hands around because I am about to say thank you so much for spending time with me. I always appreciate it. Thank you for being a kind audience. I hope that you've enjoyed what we were doing. And I want to remind everybody to please take care of yourselves, take care of those around you, be kind and be loving, because this kind of stuff is tough. It's tougher for some than others. Make sure you stay in touch with people who need it, you know, who are home alone or who are really worried about the disease because of pre-existing conditions. And also just be good to yourselves, because, you know, this is stressful stuff. And, you know, even somebody like me who's pretty hermit-like, hermetic, to use the proper adjective, even somebody like me gets tired of it after a while and begins to feel a little oppressed by reality. Of course, I started feeling oppressed by reality a long time ago, so this is just more of it as far as I'm concerned. But the point is, not everybody is having as good a pandemic as some of us. Not that we're having a great pandemic, any of us. So be aware and try to help out where you can. But first and foremost, keep yourself safe, keep your loved ones safe, keep your friends safe, keep your enemies close beside you, but don't cough on them. That's mean. I am going to bid you goodnight and say again, thank you, and say love to all of you from us at our house, from Deb and me, and all of our multitude of young people and pets and all kinds of other things. So there you go. Good night, be good, and speak to you soon. Mwah.